So the world of geopolitics has been turned upside down by the last few days of Latin American shenanigans by the Trump administration. They had seized Venezuelan President Maduro in a spectacular operation that only took 3 hours, 3-hour special military operation, as opposed to Vladimir Putin's more than 3-year special military operation here in Ukraine, where he's had very little success. Zelensky is still the Ukrainian president. Kyiv, the capital, is still free, as is here Odessa, Mama, on the shores of the Black Sea. So it's looking particularly grim for Vladimir Putin. The war is about to enter its 4th year. I think it's about the 12th year if we start the clock back in 2014 when they first invaded Crimea. And if we look at the list of targets that Donald Trump outlined, namely Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, Iran, and Greenland, well, 2 of those are significant Russian allies, Iran and Cuba. However, there is one of those targets that have been outlined again. Yesterday was reiterated by Stephen Miller in the Trump administration that they will just take control of Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO ally of the US. So is this Putin's next ploy to go and try and drive a fissure between 2 NATO partners and hopefully allow him some kind of off-ramp with a strategic victory in his wars against Ukraine? I'm going to discuss that very briefly here. Now, just before I started rolling this video, news came through that the US has seized a Russian-flagged tanker that's apparently evading sanctions. It had come from Venezuela with Venezuelan oil. The US has now tracked that down very close to Iceland, so going through the gap between the United Kingdom and Iceland. On the other side, you'd have Greenland itself, so quite apt, before it was able to get back to Russian waters. Another humiliation to pile upon the humiliations for Vladimir Putin in the last week or so. He also made up that his residence had been attacked by the Ukrainians in some sort of assassination attempt when he wasn't apparently there anyways. And Donald Trump has basically called him out for lying, quite unprecedented. So it's all looking pretty bleak if you're looking at it from Vladimir Putin's point of view or Russians' point of view in terms of winning the war in Ukraine, having a strategic victory. Now, Greenland offers a silver lining or light at the end of the tunnel, some sort of out, because if Donald Trump were to decide to try to annex Greenland, of course a major conflict there with a NATO ally, Denmark, then that would present a huge opportunity for Vladimir Putin to undermine the entire NATO structure. Now, first of all, Donald Trump will be undermining it. The words of the Danish leadership yesterday, they outlined that if the US tries to take Greenland by force, then this will be the end of NATO in effect. I'm not so sure that would actually happen. There would probably be some period where the other NATO allies are basically trying to find a way out of such a situation, maybe get the next administration to give back Greenland to Denmark or give it some other status. However, such a huge crisis, if Donald Trump were to go down that path, and he has said it multiple times in the last few days, it would represent the biggest crisis for NATO since its inception, because you would have a situation where a member state is attacked, but it is attacked by the main member state of NATO. And even though presumably the US could almost take it without a shot because they just have such a big military, and Denmark is far away from Greenland, they don't have that many troops, there isn't that big of a local population, and the US already has military bases, it would create a situation where Denmark in principle would invoke Article 5, but then that's really based around the US security guarantee, and it would be the US violating Danish sovereignty, so nothing would happen. In all likelihood, there wouldn't be a shooting war, those American troops wouldn't be removed. So where does Russia and Putin play into all of this? One thing that he has been seeking to get out of this whole series of wars against Ukraine on a kind of more top-level view of it strategically is to get NATO and principally the US to remove its security guarantee for the countries that are in NATO that were previously part of the Russian or Soviet sphere of influence / empire. So Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, probably into Central Europe. They did present a draft treaty to NATO, but basically to the US in reality is what they're trying to get at, and to roll back membership. I think they said in that draft, was it back to 1995 or something like that, or 1997? Basically, it will leave the countries like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and now of course Finland and Sweden have joined in the meantime, leave them without a US security guarantee. And that they presented just before the invasion in 2022. It was like very late 2021. So that is a strategic objective of Russia on top of winning here. They thought that would be easy. They thought that wouldn't quite be a 3-hour special military operation, but maybe not quite a 3-day special military operation, but they definitely thought 3 weeks, more or less, and definitely not almost 4 years as it has been already. And if there is this crisis within NATO itself, then they can really try to crack it open as a fissure, and they could go for a limited incursion into a member state. The most obvious ones to do that would be Latvia, grab a village there, or maybe it doesn't even have to be a populated area, but do something that would be clearly in excess of the threshold we've seen so far by Russia in terms of provocations against member states, so flying into their airspace or flying drones over their territory, even if it didn't look like they were actually charged that time. Didn't have explosives on them that time back in Poland a few months ago. Sabotage the weapons factories in NATO states that presumably are supplying armaments to Ukraine have also been targeted, but they could go for something that would normally be an Article 5 situation. What if we had this big crisis in NATO? Because what? The US is going to come and send troops on the ground to protect Latvia at the same time while they're already invaded Greenland with their troops? That's almost certainly not going to happen. It would be the exact time when Vladimir Putin should go for that. He would be able to demonstrate in Russia that he has managed to achieve something. He's managed to prove that the US is not going to guarantee the security of those countries, and then they could decide whether to escalate even further after that. Of course, that would create a very unpredictable situation, because we don't know how the other NATO states would react. How would the UK react? How would Finland react? How would Sweden react? How would the other Poland react if they were to do something? I just picked on Latvia. It could even be in Poland with the Slovakia gap, Lithuania, Finland, or else they share a border, Estonia. Those would be the principal ways that they could do that. It could be some other type of escalation, but they could really seize that opportunity kind of in desperation at this point, because Ukraine has funding from the EU for another 2 years. Russia its economy is in recession. They've got high interest rates. They're selling off their gold reserves to try and keep this funding of the war going. The oil price is low, which is one of the main exports, one of the ways that they fund the war. The sanctions are causing trouble. Now, just today, the US is seizing a Russian-flagged vessel that was circumventing the sanctions. And with this replacement of Maduro, at least in the short run, the immediate aftermath, we've seen oil prices go even lower. And the expectation is there's going to be more oil produced and sent out on the market as a result of this. So all of this is just looking really bad unless Russia goes for something like a real wildcard, like a full mobilization inside the country. Again, that is very risky for Vladimir Putin, because his main priority is staying in power. So just thought that would be a little bit thought-provoking about how dangerous it is, not just on the level of NATO, international law, first of all, if the US goes and tries to take Greenland, as they have not ruled out by military force several times in the last few days. Donald Trump has started off his presidency talking about it. J.D. Vance went there trying to provoke a huge diplomatic crisis with Denmark by encouraging the Greenlanders to become part of the US and leave the Kingdom of Denmark. Not only will we have all those problems, Western unity, is there even a collective West at that stage? If the US were to take that unprecedented step and violate the sovereignty of another fellow NATO member, but it would present this huge opportunity for Vladimir Putin to try and, the knife would have been pushed into the wound, so to speak, metaphorically, if Donald Trump were to do that, but then it could be twisted and really exacerbated if Russia were to launch some other operation. Of course, do they have the capability if they're stuck in Ukraine? Presumably, they would need to maybe even stop the fighting in Ukraine to redeploy troops in order to do that. There is the peace negotiations that Russia has no interest in at the moment. However, if that situation would arise, which seems pretty wild and pretty crazy, then that could be the move that Vladimir Putin would take, even if it sounds very extreme, but it would present that strategic opportunity to try and destroy NATO completely if Donald Trump were to take that pretty insane move, in my opinion. But he keeps talking about it. So after he has abducted the president of Venezuela in a very successful operation, maybe they're gung-ho to go and try and do that. I personally, as I said in a video a couple of days ago, I don't think that Greenland will be the next target of the US. It's a possibility, but I think Cuba and Iran, with the street protests going on in Iran, Cuba have been so tied to Venezuela. They were apparently providing a lot of protection for Maduro. It didn't work out too well for him, along with Russian air defense. Also, doesn't seem to have been very effective. It didn't shoot down any planes or any aircraft from the US coming in that very successful Delta Force operation. So I think that Cuba, because it was also reliant on the Venezuelan oil, and with Marco Rubio being the Secretary of State in the US and seems to have played a leading role in the capture of Maduro, that because he's of Cuban descent, it would be something that would be extremely popular for that consistency of the US electorate. Donald Trump is very unpopular in the US, although maybe after this Maduro move, he will have regained some popularity. So managing to replace the Cuban regime, or the Cuban leadership at least, and flip it from obviously being in this Russia-China camp to US camp, that would be something that no US president has achieved in how many years of trying? Like, is it over 60 years for sure at this point? So that could be something that's very tempting for him. There's street protests going on in Iran. They've happened before without the mullahs losing power. However, this is a new situation with them having been pretty battered by Israel in the war in the summer, where again, Russian supplied air defense, not doing very much. So not saying that I think Donald Trump is actually going to make this insane move yet, but who knows? We live on unprecedented times, definitely in the last, I don't know, since World War II. Looks more like a 19th century imperialist strategy, with him resurrecting the Monroe Doctrine and rechristening it the Don-Roe Doctrine. So leave it at that. Comments down below what you think. The sun is about to, well, the light is about to disappear in Odessa, Mama. I'm on the shores of the Black Sea. Got the iconic Odessa Opera House behind me. And if you are thinking of coming here to Ukraine in spite of the Russo-Ukrainian war, down below in the description is my guide for coming here, not just the logistical and safety information about traveling to Ukraine at this time, but you will get access to my hospitality guide, quite unique. Odessa here, all my favorite cafes, restaurants, shisha lounges and bars. Not so much clubbing going on with curfew in Ukraine these days, a little bit, but not so much. Also the capital of Kyiv, the capital of the West, shall we say, or the biggest city in the West, Lviv, lovely Lviv, Uzhhorod on the border with Slovakia and Hungary, and Chernovtsi, which is a very beautiful city, especially the center, very similar to Lviv, near to the borders with Romania and Moldova. Grab that down below, and I will see you in the next video. Do побачення, гарного вечора from Odessa.